What's going on, my capoeiristas? Today I have a cool review of Mestre Suassuna's autobiography. This book is really awesome. I got it from my master, actually, Mestre Boca, who bought this book for me in Brazil when he went to the 50 years of Cordao de Ouro event. This was just this past year. So that was the official release of the autobiography of Mestre Suassuna. And yeah, this book is really awesome. It's all in Portuguese, so if you don't know how to read Portuguese, it's going to be a little bit difficult to get through. But if you do know Portuguese, it's actually a very simple book. So even if your reading level is not that high, you can still probably get through it without really needing to look up too many words. I would say that my reading level is not amazing, but I got through the book really easily. It's a fast read. The book is no more than 200 pages long, but every bit of it's really exciting to read and get through and hear the really fantastic stories about Mestre Suassuna, things that you wouldn't really hear otherwise. I think a really cool thing to bring up is that Mestre Suassuna is a huge figure in the world of capoeira. Everybody knows him, or everybody knows about him, and because he's such a huge presence, you would think that this sort of legendary person is like this huge guy. He's like massive, this really tall dude. One of his students, you know, when he went to his academy, and of course there's no internet back in the 70s and 60s when Mestre Suassuna started, when the student went to go see him, he thought, oh, he's gonna be this tall, African looking warrior dude. It wasn't the case at all. He's like this small, white guy with like a little belly, but he knew how to move and he knew how to teach. And so that's kind of the two things that helped him really grow and be successful. He had a great personality and people really brought themselves to him. So I'm gonna split this into 3 sections. There's gonna be the first chapter, second and third chapter, and then is the 4th chapter. The first and the last chapter are the biggest, so I'll go through those in their own little sections. And the second and third chapter are a little bit smaller, so I'll go through them together. So without further ado, here's the first chapter. So Mestre Suassuna, when he was born a very small child, very weak and frail, and that kind of carried with him for a long while until he started doing capoeira. Actually, when he was born, he even had a sudden case of death, it seems. I'm not even sure what to call it. His heart stopped beating, and his family actually thought that he died for a while until he was somehow brought back to life by his grandmother, which is pretty crazy. So how did Mestre Suassuna actually get into capoeira? Mestre Suassuna's doctor recommended that he do some sort of physical activity to help with his general weakness, is how it's described in the book. It's not really in depth, and I wonder if he really went to like a specialist to figure out what was wrong, but whatever, that's what we have. So he goes to the doctor. The doctor says you need to do something, and hey, capoeira was close, boxing's a little rough, and you know, it was just a convenience thing. He didn't actually like capoeira when he started. He didn't like it at all. He thought it was weird, kind of boring, I guess. So he does capoeira begrudgingly. This is when Mestre Suassuna is about 20 years old. He just is getting started, and he starts training at Major Doria's academy. And Major Doria's academy is interesting. Now, Major Doria is not a capoeirista, but he is somebody who was part of the military and then eventually created his own academy for physical fitness. He hosted a bunch of different things there, one of which was capoeira. The other thing that was interesting about this academy is that it had both capoeira Angola and capoeira regional. Two things that you typically don't really see together in the capoeira world. They're usually separated, but in this case, he had them both. So he had capoeira regional in the academy, and he had capoeira Angola outside. I don't know if that was like some slide to capoeira Angola, but you know, that's how it was. But the interesting thing is that you had both things, and I think that you can kind of see that influence in Mestre Suassuna, because he does have a lot of respect for capoeira Angola, and you can see it in his students, in him. So that's a really cool little bit of information to find out about. So his beginnings were there. The two teachers who hosted the classes at the time for capoeira regional was Mestre Maneca, and then for capoeira Angola was Mestre Sarará. I'm sorry, Mestre Sururu. So the teacher of capoeira Angola was Mestre Sururu. And interestingly enough, at this time, you can imagine, this is when Mestre Bimba has his academy not just starting but running. It's been running for about 20-30 years at this point. He has a bunch of students, and so these students are doing performances around the state of Bahia where Mestre Suassuna lived at the time. And so Mestre Suassuna actually saw some of these performances as well, and it's kind of like a cool little thing where you see how one legendary figure, Mestre Bimba, interacts with another also legendary figure but significantly younger than him. So at the time when Mestre Suassuna is starting up, Mestre Bimba has the students doing all these performances, all these folkloric things like puxada de rede, capoeira regional. They're doing the balões, a bunch of other performances and just generally cool things. So that kind of got Mestre Suassuna's attention. He eventually starts training with them as well when he can. He goes over to Salvador and he trains with Mestre Bimba's students, and that kind of is an interesting thing for him. Because at the time, Mestre Suassuna is training, but what really pushes him to go really hard is when he encounters Mestre Bimba's students. And, you know, capoeira regional is tough, and it seems like he got his butt kicked. And from that experience, he really took it and said like, oh no, I need to get way better. And so he does that. He gets a lot better. He trains harder. He learns moves that he didn't know before, like negativa, which is really strange that negativa wasn't a move that Mestre Suassuna knew for a while until he went to Mestre Bimba's academy, and which is something I want to know a little bit more about too, right? Because why would you not know about a move that is seen today as being very basic, negativa? So Mestre Suassuna all this time is training with at Major Doria's academy, and eventually he actually starts teaching there. And he doesn't really have that many years of experience, which is, I think, a very interesting point. Something that would be harder to do nowadays, I think. But he does start teaching, and after a few years of doing that, he leaves the academy in the hands of another student of his, who I don't know how many years of experience he has either, but Mestre Medicina. Eventually, this is the person, but he leaves the academy in his hands while he goes to Sao Paulo. So just to give you a quick overview of how the timeline works, you have Mestre Suassuna being born in 1938. He starts training capoeira in 1958. He eventually starts training at Major Doria's academy in 1962. After a couple years, though it's not really specific, Mestre Suassuna starts teaching the classes himself, and then in the year 1965, Mestre Suassuna leaves. He leaves Bahia and he goes to Sao Paulo, and he leaves his class to Mestre Medicina, who is not Mestre at this time. I'm not really sure if he was formado or anything like that. It's not really clear what the belt system was. I know that that's kind of like, that's more concrete nowadays, but back then it sure as hell doesn't look like it was. So the book doesn't go into it really, and you know, I haven't really heard too much of that, but yeah, basically you had Mestre Suassuna, who is more or less a student at this point, teaching the classes, and then he hands it off to another student of his to teach the classes after that, which is, like, I think kind of funny. But one thing I really liked about this chapter is it's full of little tidbits, and one of them is that Mestre Suassuna gave his school a name after Mestre Maneca left. It was called the Academia de Capoeira Regional de Itabuna, or the Itabuna Academy of Capoeira Regional. So you see that the style is there. They were training regional at that time. The other cool thing is that Mestre Suassuna makes reference to legendary figures like Mestre João Grande and Mestre Bimba. And interestingly enough, Mestre João Grande wasn't called Mestre João Grande at the time. He was called Batistaca, which is, like, I don't know, a cool thing to know. Like, he wasn't always called Mestre João Grande. He had actually had another name, and then he kind of grew into a different name that he had. So if you don't like your name, if you work hard enough, people might call you something cooler than what you're called now. The last thing that I'll bring up is something that, again, it's stuff that I feel like wouldn't fly today, really, like having a student teach, though that does actually fly, I shouldn't say that, but Mestre Suassuna didn't really play the berimbau for a long time, it seems. And even when he was teaching classes, he didn't know how to play the berimbau, or maybe he didn't know how to play it that well. But the point is that he actually brought a friend to play the berimbau for him during the classes. So I don't know what to make of that. That's nuts to me. Something that I would really like to know from Mestre Bimba is why he started teaching the class. Like, this book actually brought up a lot of questions for me, and I thought it was such a cool insight into how capoeira was taught and done 50 years ago. And one thing that I really would like to know is why Mestre Suassuna decided to teach. He didn't need to teach, he wasn't obligated to teach, I don't think, but he really made the decisions to teach, and I think that's a pretty cool thing, and I would really like to know his reasons for doing that. I wonder if he felt like it was just the next thing, or you know, he thought that he would actually be able to create a career out of that. Maybe he didn't think about it in those terms, maybe he just liked it, but I would really like to know his motivation. So that's chapter 1. 1965, Mestre Suassuna leaves, he goes to Sao Paulo. So that's what I'll be talking about in the second episode of this trilogy, where I'll be covering chapters 2 and 3. So again, this is a review of Mestre Suassuna's biography, chapter 1. And I almost forgot to mention that the author is Mestre Boca Rica. So in case you were wondering, he's the guy who made this wonderful book. So again, thanks for watching. For more content, keep an eye on the channel. I'm going to be picking it up, trying to add more stuff as we go along. Like and subscribe, and let me know what you think. What kind of things are you curious to know about Mestre Suassuna's history? This is really the story of his life. It'd be interesting to know what people want to hear about. So leave your comments in the comment section below. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time.